Hi, family. It's Liz Gilbert. Here we are on the amazing Onward Book Club. We are here today discussing this extraordinary book by Klancy Miller. It's called For the Culture, Phenomenal Black Women and Femmes in Food, Interviews, Inspirations, and Recipes. And Klancy has been generous enough to come on in, Klancy. Hello, hello. See if this will work. Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Here she goes.
Yay! Hi!
Oh my God, look at your beauty and radiance.
Yay!
It's actually you.
Likewise. This is awesome.
Oh,
this is fun. I'm very excited.
We are so happy that you're here. Everybody, please send up a bunch of hearts and a bunch of love to our special, beautiful guest, Klancy Miller, who is the author of For the Culture, Phenomenal Black Women and Femmes in Food, Interviews, Inspirations, and Recipes. I am so excited to welcome you to the Onward Book Club. We have been, I want to tell you that before the moment this book was announced, my friend Margaret, who does this book club with me, was like, we've got to get her on. We've got to get her on. We've been waiting for it to be published. We've been waiting for you to come here, and we are so happy to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and very grateful and honored.
Yay! So I am going to turn off the comments right now so that we can focus on your beautiful face. And so everyone, this is your last chance to say hi to Klancy, but just send up a lot of love and hearts, and please stick on the call and be with us because I've got so many questions for you, and I can't wait to do it. Okay, so here we go. Turn off commenting. All right.
Yeah.
Welcome. We have a custom here at the Onward Book Club where we pour love into you at the very beginning of the interview by introducing everyone to who you are. And here is our from the heart introduction about why you are so great.
Oh.
For the Culture by Klancy Miller. In addition to being the author of the gorgeous book For the Culture, Phenomenal Black Women and Femmes in Food, it'll probably look backwards on your screen, but there it is. Klancy Miller is the founder of an annual magazine by the same name, For the Culture, that highlights and celebrates the crucial impact that Black female cooks, business owners, bartenders, nonprofit executives, farmers, community activists, seed savers, historians, and others have had on food and drink culture in America. The book features 66 interviews with literal tastemakers, as well as tributes to an earlier generation of matriarchs, not to mention, of course, we love this, recipes. Klancy herself is a cordon bleu trained pastry chef and writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Bon Appetit, and Vogue, among others. And she's the author of a cookbook that I love very much for personal reasons, whose premise is brilliant. It's called Cooking Solo, The Fun of Cooking for Yourself, which is something that I love to do. It teaches us single people, woo woo, how to make meals for ourselves with style and intention. In other words, to treat ourselves like guests without having to pare down standard recipes or cook more than we need. Klancy's work as a chef, researcher, writer, and I would say scholar is uniquely thoughtful, and I'm so delighted to welcome her to the Onward Book Club. Thank you, Klancy.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having me.
I want to start with the title. For people who are not familiar with this phrase, could you explain to people exactly what For the Culture means and precisely what it means for you?
I think of it frequently. Honestly, I think of it often in terms of music. But I think I was introduced to the phrase from a documentary on Toni Morrison talking about things being for the culture, whether it's the written word or music or any form of the arts. And so that's how I think of it, something for the collective culture. In terms of this book and its title, I think of Black women and femmes as being essential culture makers in this country and in many, many, many countries throughout the world. And so I wanted to focus on culture makers for the culture, and specifically Black women and femme culinary culture culture makers for the culture. So it's kind of, I think of it as a gift, something, an offering to the collective culture.
I felt that as I was reading it, and not just reading it, but eating it. It's such a rich book, and I can feel it as an offering because of how much time you obviously put into this. I mean, everyone puts time into their books, but it's also a visually stunning and beautiful book. The illustrations of every single woman who you profile, like each one is so vivid. And I want to ask you about that before we even begin, how you envisioned this as a work of art, in addition to a gift of culture. And then, I mean, it's photography and it's drawings and it's interviews and it's stories and it's history. It's so extravagant in the best definition of the word. It's a buffet. And I wondered if from the very beginning, does it look like what you wanted it to look like from the beginning?
Honestly, it looks better than I had ever envisioned. And I have to give credit to the creative director and art director for the book, George McCalman, who actually helped me to see that illustration would be the way to go for this book. Initially, I was very attached to photography throughout, not just for the recipes, but for portraits for everybody. And George helped me to see that budget-wise, and given the fact that the people in the book are from several continents, based in many different countries and many different places. And so it was clear that was going to be difficult to be able to have gorgeous photographic portraits of everyone. And he's like, I really feel like illustration is the way to go. And he introduced me to Sarah Madden, who is a stunning genius illustrator and designer based in the UK. And she brought each person in this book to life. She really understood the uniqueness of each person's story, and I think really just immersed herself in each interview, in each essay, and did such a gorgeous job of,
Stunning.
yeah.
Stunning.
My breath was taken away when I first saw the first drafts. I was just like, oh wow, this is it. This is it.
It's magnificent. I wanted to ask you about your 21-year-old self as we're beginning this story, because you write in the introduction that coming into the food world and the hospitality world as a young woman of color, you felt unmoored, and you felt that you didn't have you couldn't find your role models. You couldn't necessarily find people who looked like you. There's a lot of mention in this book about the difference between what's happening in the back of house in restaurants, with people of color working in the back of the house, but white people working in the front of the house, as the face of the restaurant and managing, and just you trying to find and pave your way in this world. And I wonder if did you write this book sort of as what you wish you had when you were 21 years old? And do you see, not to ask you how old you are, do you see differences now in that world than when you were first coming up?
Absolutely, yes, to both questions. So I definitely wrote this book because it's something I really would have benefited from when I was just starting out. And not just starting out in kitchens, but starting to have an interest in food and realizing that, oh, I think I might want to explore a career in the world of food, however that looks. And when I was 21, I think I really just thought it was, you're either a chef, you either work in a kitchen, or maybe you own a restaurant, or both. Maybe you're a baker. But I really didn't have that many ideas of what the options were in the world of food, including writing about food. I just didn't, I wasn't aware of the vast options available. So that would have been helpful for me as a curious person interested in food. So in that sense, absolutely, I wanted to kind of create a resource for people just starting out, a resource for people interested in learning, or for people who just love food and people who make food. Um, and then in terms of how things look now versus, you know, a couple of decades ago when I was just starting out, I think there's so much more diversity. I think there's so, and I also know a lot more people. Like I know so many more people. So my personal world feels fuller, and I've learned a lot just over the past 3 years working on this book, but I have,
I learned a lot over the reading the book.
yay.
Sorry to interrupt you, but like this is when I said you're a scholar, I feel like I just got a master's degree in like Black food history and the women of the diaspora and
Oh,
these intersections of Jamaican and African and European and Southern traditions and also what is included in food culture, because I thought this was strictly going to be a book of, when I was excited about it, but I thought it was just going to be recipes. Um, but who you included are also people who are like rum chemists, you know, and of course wine sommeliers and hoteliers and food writers and food photographers. Like it just, I didn't sort of understand how broad the world of food was. So anyway, I completely interrupted you, but I just wanted to say that because I feel like I just got a big education reading this
yay.
in the best way.
I'm so glad. That makes me happy. That's mission accomplished.
Yeah, very much. Well done. Um, I want to talk about spaces that are created to feed people, but which become something so much larger. You've got one of the most moving things about this book is that it begins with these literal portraits of these great Black female matriarchs who seem to be the pillars upon which all the Black women who came into the food world in America after them, you know, just regard as these almost biblical figures, you know, and including Leah Chase, whose restaurant in New Orleans, Dookie Chase's, was one of the only places where activists of all backgrounds and races could gather to organize during the Jim Crow era. And she fed the Freedom Riders, she fed James Baldwin, Martin Luther King Jr. And there's this great line that she says, "We changed the course of America over a bowl of gumbo." And then her restaurant became an informal art gallery for Black artists. And can you talk about how you see that, how these spaces that were originally conceived of perhaps as one thing, that Black women were creating these almost like these magnet spaces where like-minded people could come and find safety and inspiration and fellowship and community. And I would just love to hear about how you perceive that.
Well, I think Leah Chase is an excellent example of that. I feel like her statement of, you know, changing the world or changing the country over a bowl of gumbo, so much happens. It's almost cliche to say, but over a meal, we can create these moments. There are moments for conversation. There are moments for connection. There are moments for arguments sometimes. And I think that food is the pivotal part, the food and the people. So the fact that Leah Chase or Lena Richard or so many people in the book created spaces that allowed for conversations, dialogue, strategy making to take place. And sometimes in social senses, sometimes in political senses. But I think there's this blueprint of making your own space and kind of improvising. Leah Chase's restaurant actually started out as like a lotto shop sandwich bar. So the idea that you could create something really powerful out of a very humble space over something as basic as food is it's just incredible to me. And I think each person, especially among the matriarchs who I cover, and I could have covered many, many more, like many more. Georgia Gilmore is a person who I've written about, and I kind of wanted to write about people who I hadn't written about before, but she helped fund the Montgomery bus boycott through doing bake sales. And so just the act of putting people together and letting food be the glue is something that I think everyone in the book has in common, and particularly the matriarchs who are no longer here covered.
I'm glad you brought up the idea that you could have put more people in this book than you did, because I was wondering how you made your selections, and whether that was a painful process, because I can imagine that once you got started on this, and there are so many different interpretations of what food culture is, that you could have just opened it up more and more and more. And of course, you know everybody because you've been writing for the Culture magazine for so long, and you've been in this world for so long. How did you narrow it down to, and is there something magical about the number 66? I just want, it's such a specific number. It's not 100, it's not 50, it's not 75. I was like, why 66? And then was it painful to leave people out? And is there going to be a sequel? Please say yes.
Well, fingers crossed. I would love for there to be a sequel. In terms of the number, in all honesty, it's very random. I knew I wanted a robust number, a number that felt like, okay, there are a lot of people, a lot of conversations, a lot of paths and stories. But I was very clear I didn't want to do 100. There was one potential publisher that was interested in the book, but they clearly stated they wanted 100 interviews. And I just thought, I'm not doing that. I knew I was going to have to do it. I knew I was going to have to do the work. And I just thought, I can't do that in this time frame. I can do something under 100, preferably under 75. And so numbers wise, it was under 100, preferably, like I said, like significantly under 100. But I also wanted to have women and femmes of different ages, different generations. I wanted to have something that felt like a good representation of the diaspora in terms of Black women based in the US, on the continent of Africa, in the Caribbean, based in Europe. I wanted to have people at different stages of their careers. So
yeah, I noticed that.
yeah,
I like
there's
that. Yeah.
a teenager in the book. She's in college right now. Rihanna, she's amazing. Rihanna Bisrat Martinez. She's the youngest. I think she's 18, 19 now. And then I don't know everybody's age, but there are many, many generations in the book. And I wanted to interview people who I never have had the chance to speak with. I kind of,
That's why I
inner fan.
do this book club.
Exactly, right? Yeah, it's brilliant. Brilliant. So I wanted to interview friends. I wanted to interview strangers. And then there really was the question of who responded to my emails and who I had a mutual friend who could get me in contact with people who I don't actually have contact information for. So the number 66 became random. That's how many I could do.
I love that extremely honest question or answer rather. I have two favorite things in this book, two favorite lines, and I'll get to the second one second. But the first one is a line by Verda May Smart Grosvenor. I don't know how to pronounce her last name.
Grosvenor, yeah.
Grosvenor, who is one of the matriarchs, who is an extraordinary person who I had never heard of before this. And I also want to say that's why this book is so important, because you say in the foreword, if you've heard of Julia Child, then you should have heard of these women. Absolutely. And now I feel very grateful to have heard of them. But she said, I only cook by vibration. And it was about intuition and energy and the way that she felt her way into recipes. And that thread moves through this entire book, because throughout the book, people are talking about energy, about like Lisa Binns says, it's all about the vibration that you give out. There's somebody in the book who's quoted as saying, don't cook for people you don't like, because it ruins the food and it ruins the energy, like there's a sense of something that's intuitive, that comes from a very deep place of heart, of connection to land, connection to ancestors, connection to spirit, that I don't feel like I've ever seen before in any of the cookbooks that I've read. So I wondered if you could speak about what vibration means to you in this sense, because I found that just beautiful and moving and inspiring.
Um, I
And
think of it.
also what vibration is, how it works in your life in terms of this project.
Okay, so I think of vibration as energy. I sometimes think of it in a musical sense, in terms of not necessarily a hum or a sound, but a feeling you are kind of a channel for, you know? And I feel like you want to start, as with everything in life, from a good place. You know, you want to start from a good place because you're communicating outward. In food, you are sharing. So you are also, if you're just sharing it with yourself, you want to have a good energy that you are sharing with others and or yourself. And so that's how I think of it. And I think in terms of vibration and energy, you're creating an atmosphere, you know, with a meal. When you're sharing a meal, that is, you have the potential to have a good time. You have the potential to lift the mood higher, similar, in my opinion, to music. You can create something greater, perhaps, than the sum of its parts with food and people. And in terms of my own life, in terms of, I don't know, I guess I'm always looking for good vibes. Like on a fundamental level, I'm always looking for good energy. I'm trying to, you know, express good energy. I think in terms of food, it's a question of clarity. What am I trying to do here? You know, what's going on? What am I going to make with this, with these ingredients? And who am I serving? How would I like for them to feel? And so it's a feeling, it's intention, it's a desire, I think, to uplift in a very simple way, you know, just create a good feeling. That's how I think of it.
Yeah, I think that's so beautifully put, and I think it's very telling that a lot of the women in this book, especially the older women, didn't have what we would call formal training.
Mm-hmm.
Although they certainly had training, like they certainly had been, working since they were 14, 15 years old in kitchens. Like they had a hands-on experience of life, but in many ways, in many cases, they were excluded from places where they could get formal training. And so they were literally feeling their way into, or paving their way, or creating channels where there had never been one before. And it also, I just think that traditional foodways are all about that vibration. I remember trying to get my grandmother to teach me how to make her apple pies. My grandmother was a Minnesota farm wife who had made an apple pie nearly every day for her entire life, cooking for farm hands, for her sons and uncles and husbands when they would come in for a coffee break, and have apple pie every single day at 9 o'clock in the morning after they'd been working already for 5 hours out in the fields. And I was like, I'm going to sit down with her and I'm going to have her teach me how to do this. And it was useless. I mean, you know this. It's like, she started by saying, well, you have to feel the apples, and then you just have to, sort of sense how much. I mean, she'd been doing this every day for 85. How's she going to explain it?
Ah,
She's like, and she said, you put in the right amount of sugar for how the apples are, like, she's
totally.
like, you can't nail that recipe down. And I wondered if, as a food writer, you've encountered that at times where you're trying to capture something. You keep talking about music, and I think that metaphor is really good too, where you're trying to capture something that maybe doesn't even want to be captured.
Absolutely. I think the idea of doing something by feel, and just kind of knowing by trial and error, and maybe a little bit of tasting, you taste the piece of the apple and oh, this is very sweet, so less sugar here. I think you definitely come into, especially when you're trying to I don't want to say translate somebody else's recipe, but make it a working recipe that other people can use. I have definitely, especially when working with chefs, but also working with home cooks, worked on recipes that, okay, I realize this is in your head. this is all in your fingers and in your head, and I just have to kind of maybe try to make it myself or get into that zone of, all right, I think this is what's going on here. And you have to kind of feel it out. But sometimes in the case of writing about food or specifically recipe development, it's feeling it out and getting out measuring cups to see like, okay, I'm feeling it out and it comes up to this much flour.
Right, because there's a science of,
Yeah,
there's a science, and there's also, if you're publishing recipes, people have to be able to use them. So you can't just say, feel the apples until you can sense how much sugar you need.
totally.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah. And it's weird because I work in both ways. When I cook, I very rarely use recipes, but I do sometimes use recipes, and I definitely write recipes. So it's like, it's an interesting line to walk.
Well, the recipes are absolutely gorgeous. And for anybody who's just joining us, we're talking about this amazing book, which I just recommended that people buy as Christmas gifts to anybody on your list who's a food person or a history person, because it's not just a food book, it's a history book. And there's also a level, it's called, I'm sorry, I know that shows up backwards on the screen, For the Culture, Phenomenal Black Women and Femmes in Food by the great, thorough, amazing historian and cultivator of culture, Klancy Miller, who's with us today. One of the interviews that I found was so moved by was Davida Davison's interview. She's from Food Lab, Detroit, Michigan, and she has this quote that I was very moved by. At the end of the day, the goal is power. How do we extract power from this corporately owned takeover of our food system and bring power back into the hands of the people? So that's how I describe my work. I set out to empower folks, and the medium in which I do it is food, and the vehicle is small business ownership. I loved that line, and it sort of intersected with something that Karen Washington said. We are not guests here. She was talking about being Black farmers, and she was talking about how Black women, I mean, I think all women experience this, but from what I understand and have been told and believe, that women of color even more suffer from imposter syndrome, oftentimes when entering spaces where they aren't welcome. And she makes this incredible clarity of distinction between, there's a difference between feeling like an imposter and feeling like you're not invited and not welcome. And just because you're not invited doesn't mean you're an imposter. Just because you're not welcome doesn't mean you shouldn't be there. And I loved this line, speaking for a long history of Black farming in this country. We're not guests here. We've been working this land longer than many of you have. And we belong here. And so the story of power that runs through this, and the story of the reclaiming of power, where we're not going to be employees of a corporate food system that's destroying the land, the people who are eating it, and culture. We're going to create our own thing. Could you speak to that, and who inspires you? I mean, I know all of these women do, but who comes to mind, and whose story do you think you've discovered that really like lights the way on this? I know there was a lot in that question. You can pick out of it whatever you choose to answer.
Okay, well, I'll say Davida is one of the people who lights the way for me, because I find her interview incredibly moving. Specifically, I think you picked the best quote in terms of that questioning of power and resources. And she talks a lot about community building from like church basements and church kitchens, and the resources that we have at our disposal right now, and using them differently, and creating community and connections via those resources. Davida is definitely one of the people who lights the way. I think of Leah Penniman.
Can you tell everybody who she is? Because
Oh,
I know who she is now,
okay.
having read this, but I would love it if you told people what she's doing in Detroit.
Yes. Okay. So Davida is the executive director of Food Lab in Detroit, working with different businesses, building up different businesses, often Black women-owned food businesses in Detroit. I believe she also started working on another arm of Food Lab in Chicago. So creating resources, creating means for people to grow their businesses. And these are often very small businesses, food businesses, working with local farmers and trying to grow and create community for people in these cities. And she comes, I also relate to Davida because she's a preacher's kid, as am I, and like grew up in churches and seeing people create community, create change in their church kitchens and helping people build things from there. So I think she's an incredible leader. She's an incredible innovator. Yeah, I just think she's phenomenal and somebody who is always doing incredible work. Leah Pinneman, in terms of her approach to farming and using indigenous foodways in terms of stewarding the land, her approach to even thinking about farming as stewardship, and having that connection to the land and teaching people stewardship, teaching people not just about the land, but also about traditions that predate the founding of this country. I think of her as an incredible person, lighting the way on many levels, environmental levels, farming levels. Who else? There's so many people. Lisa Benz, who's based in Jamaica, incredible vegan chef who is also running a restaurant and with her partner running a farm, and working with what is immediately available. It was interesting talking with her, and she was saying, you know, you can't grow everything everywhere, even within a tropical climate. Something that might work in one country that has a tropical climate might not work here. And just, I don't know, I just think of the gems of wisdom that each of them and each person in the book offer in terms of their understanding of land and learning
and
about,
seeds.
yeah, and
Seeds show up a lot in this book, like seed preservation. Yeah, and yeah, it's really important.
absolutely. Yeah. So those are just a few, but the whole book really.
Yeah, for sure. I also loved your interview with Cicely Johnson, who's a chef and restaurateur. To describe her work, she said, "It's rooted in Black American nostalgia. I love how we were raised, our culture, hanging out until the streetlights come on, from cleaning on Saturdays to church on Sundays, and how food is woven into all of that." And it made me, you mentioned being a preacher's daughter, and it made me want to ask you about the relationship with food in the culture, the particular culture of your family, and what are some of the traditions that you grew up with, and what were you taught, and what have you carried forward from that upbringing?
Let's see. Weirdly, I think of like it's a very weird tradition that my dad and I used to have after I was a kid. We would go get candy bars. So that is like, that was my treat for like showing up at church. We would go, like, I would call it. But in terms of family and church meals, I think of like fried fish dinners at church. I definitely think in terms of my family traditions, both of my parents grew up in the South, my mom in Virginia, my dad in Georgia. So I think of really big family gatherings in terms of Thanksgiving and Christmas, and again, birthdays with like a giant fish fry that the entire neighborhood comes to, which means a lot of cousins. Or I think especially going to my grandma's house when I was a kid, having greens, like having a spiral cooked ham, like different things that are pretty common throughout the South and probably throughout the States, but just those are big parts of my food memories growing up. I think also the idea of opening your home, you know, and having people come in and having, I think towards my teen years on, we weren't going down south as much for holiday dinners, but just opening up our doors to people who maybe didn't have family members and having that be kind of our form of hospitality. Like, if you need a place to come because the holidays are hard for you, come to our house. So, and that's kind of, I think, a church part of, you know, trying to show generosity and hospitality and kindness to everyone.
I'm thinking of a couple things. Amethyst Ganaway's line, "We have each other and we got good food."
Yeah.
You know, like, this is what we have, and this is what, and also this is the priority.
Yeah.
Like, the food is like, there might not be much, but what we have in abundance is this food and this hospitality and this sense of sharing. And I'm also struck, I'm thinking of just the sacredness of feeding people, and how in the Bible, how many times Jesus says to feed the hungry, like, talks about that a lot. Like, it comes up a lot, and how Gandhi said about Christianity, to a person who is poor and starving, what could God be but bread?
Mm.
You know, the idea of like, bread is God. It's like, of course it is. I mean, this is life, and there's so much in this book about, there are people who talk about, you know, doing work that they're not being paid for because they want to be feeding people, they want to be hosting people. Like, there's this incredible sense of generosity that runs through this. And I'm wondering, who are some of the most generous people you've met in your food journeys? I
Oh,
can
wow.
think of mine. I can think of some meals I've had in the world with people where I was like, actually, my friend Margaret, who does this project with me, who you've been in contact with, she's Italian, and I've been having dinner at her family's house for pretty much 30, well, I guess 35 years now. We've been
Wow.
having, like, ever since I was in college, and they took me in, and it's just like, you know, and I just remember her mother always saying, "This is the most important thing that we spend money on. We don't care about anything else. Like, we don't care if the heat is on or off, but the food will be really good." So I was wondering about some of the stories of food generosity that you've encountered in your life.
Um, I left out something, but I would include that in the food generosity. At one of my dad's churches, we would do, well, there was a daily soup kitchen, and we would participate on the holidays. Like, and I think of soup kitchens as forms of generosity. There's a person in the book, Kia Damone, who founded an organization, Kia Feeds the People, which has to do with food scarcity and mutual aid through food. Um, and she does incredible pop-up dinners. I think of her as a deeply generous person because a lot of times her food is for, it's, I mean, in pop-ups it's obviously for other people, but she's a person who uses her culinary talents for fundraising, you know, for giving to people in organizations in need. I think a lot of people in the book do that. uh I think of Dr. Jessica B. Harris, who's a person who has been incredibly generous in terms of guidance she has offered to so many people in the food world.
Can,
A lot of,
can you share with us who she is? Because I,
oh
again,
yeah,
had not heard of her, and almost everyone in this book mentions her as a mentor, as a guide, as a guiding light.
for sure. So Dr. Jessica B. Harris is an amazing person who, for I think possibly 4 decades, was a professor at City College here in New York. But she also has had this incredible career as a writer about food and travel, kind of what we would call maybe a side hustle in addition to her academic life. And I will mention one of her most famous books, High on the Hog, because it is currently a show on Netflix. It's in its second season. And that book kind of covers the story of African and African American foodways from the continent to the US and throughout the diaspora. It's that is one of her most famous books because of the show. But she has written tons of books about Black foodways. And I consider her both an historian and kind of anthropologist. And she's also just a really generous person who, you know, is willing to get on the phone with you if you're, you know, having some issues with X, Y, and Z in your food life. She's done that with me. She's done that with countless people. And I just think of that as a generosity of spirit because she has done so much. So she has accumulated a lot of knowledge in terms of food media, in terms of travel, in terms of writing books, in terms of forging one's path. Yeah, and her generosity has been really extraordinary, in my opinion.
Speaking of generosity and scarcity and abundance and forging one's own path, you do something really radical in this book, and you do it on almost every page. The interviews are so wonderful because there are some set questions that you ask everyone, and I love that at the very end you ask them of yourself, because I wanted to know your answers to all of those questions. So I love that you ask those of yourself as well. You know, what do you, you know, where do you have any regrets? What are your inspirations? What is your, you know, like these, but then you also go off into very specific things based on each person's individual path. But you ask each woman about money. And money is, I feel like it's the last taboo in this culture. My beloved friend, the novelist Ann Patchett, has a rule, and that she said, we have to talk about money. Whenever you're around another author, you have to tell them how much you're earning. You have to tell them what your royalties are. You have to, because people will tell you everything in the entire world about their sex life before they're going to talk about money. And there's no way that you can know how to handle this if you don't have any guidance. And so you ask each woman for advice about negotiating, what their experience has been with money. And what I heard again and again was people saying, know your worth. You have to know your worth, and you have to push. I love this line Julia Coney said, if you start working for free, you'll never move ahead. If what you ask for doesn't make you shake a little bit and make you nervous, then you're asking for too little. And I wanted to ask you about your motivation for wanting to bring the subject of money into every single one of these interviews. I really appreciated it, but I also was thinking about when I was negotiating a book deal about 10 years ago, and my agent, who I've worked with forever, who I love and trust, who's a woman, I mean, I've been with her since I was 23, and she had a number in mind that she wanted to go and ask for, and that number made me shake because I felt like it was too high, and I didn't want the pressure of having to live up to that expectation. It scared me. And this is fear of success, which is a fear of abundance. I was like, oh, that's frightening. I don't, that number's terrifying. I don't think I can manage that. And I don't want the pressure. And she said in her wonderful British accent, Liz, I know what the men are earning. Please. And she said, I've never heard a man say, ask them to lower the amount of money. You know, she said women say that kind of thing all the time, but she's like, I know what they're earning, and they don't sell as many books as you sell, and they don't work as hard as you work, and they're not as good as you. So please just let me do this, you know? So it's such an important thing. It's why also a lot of the women talked about having Black and female accountants and Black and female CPAs who are helping them guide their financial journeys. So anyway, I just wanted to know, what was your motivation specifically for wanting to introduce the single and perhaps the last taboo topic on earth that people are so afraid to talk about openly to this book?
I first of all, I feel like I'm still figuring it out, truly. How does one make money? Or I know how to make money, but how do people do it is really my question all the time. How are people, and I live in New York City, it's an expensive place. So I'm always wondering, how is anybody making it? And I don't mean making it in a very glamorous way. I mean in a basic way. And then in kind of a nice way, you know, like, how are you making it and going on a vacation? and these are things I do, but I kind of am in constant amazement at seeing people live their lives also on social media. But long story short, I kind of wanted to know, like, how are you approaching this? Because I don't really have as much figured out as I would like to have figured out. So I wanted people to tell me how they go about negotiating, because I think I have a lot to learn. I think most people have a lot to learn when it comes to money. I think most people have a lot to learn when it comes to just asking about money, which is kind of all I wanted to do. I wanted to learn some things and just put it out there. And also, I don't know, I really wanted to learn some like secrets and tricks, like not secrets in terms of dark secrets, but I wanted to know, like, is there something I should be doing that I'm not doing? Tell me.
Or is there something you're doing that you shouldn't be doing?
Yeah.
I mean, there's some really, really good guidance in here, you know, like, I really appreciated, you know, the food industry is a very insecure world. I mean, how many restaurants close versus how many stay open? And, you know, opening up a restaurant is a fantasy that so many people have, but it was really powerful. I can't remember now exactly who it was who said it in one of these interviews, who said, like, don't go into any relationship whatsoever in working in a restaurant with people who don't have money. Like, there's so many people who have creativity. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's true. You're right. Things not to do, things to avoid at all
Don't
costs.
quit your day job was another one that nobody ever says.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been saying that for years to people creatively. I'm like, please don't do that. It makes my skin hurt. It makes my eyes bleed when people say they're going to quit their job to work on a book. I'm like, I didn't quit my day job till my fourth book. My day jobs. I had so many jobs, and that book was Eat, Pray, Love. If it wasn't for Eat, Pray, Love, I'd still have, like, don't do this to yourself. Like, don't, you know, like, don't put this pressure on yourself. So yeah, there's really prudent advice in here, hard one from some really wise sources.
Yeah, I'm very grateful people were open to answering that question. Um, Nobody shut me down. So that was great to be able to include so many gems of wisdom, because
Yeah,
it's important.
it's really important. And it's important to know, I mean, this happened a couple of years ago, and it was one of the main reasons that I started this book club, was because the New York Times started running articles about the discrepancy in what Black women were being paid in the publishing world for their books versus white women. And I was mortified. You know, people who are so much more critically acclaimed than I am, making a tenth of what I make. You know, and it's all because of this algorithm inside of the publishing world that says Black women's books don't sell, so we're not going to give them money for their books. Oh, we didn't give them money for their books, so now we don't have a budget for publicity, so the book didn't sell. So that just proves that it doesn't. You know, it's just this, like,
Totally.
terrible loop. You know, and I was like, this is. You know, this is appalling. Like, so these conversations need to be had for a multitude of reasons, on both the macro level and on, like, how are we all managing this on the macro level, and how are we all managing this in the micro level? It's essential. So I was really grateful that you had the courage to bring it up, and
Yay.
that the women you interviewed were courageous enough to answer. I want to talk about social media, because I'm super curious about how everyone is doing social media these days. I don't know what your personal experience with social media has been, but for me, it's very much like a drug that started as a party drug that seemed to be really fun, and that then we've all become addicted to, and that's destroying the world and taking all of our attention and killing us. And, like, I'm thinking about how I felt about Facebook 10 years ago. I'm like, this is so much fun. You can
Oh
just,
my
you
gosh.
know, like, you can put pictures on, and people, you know, and now I'm like, oh, I'm addicted. I got addicted to this algorithm that now we know was specifically designed to make me addicted. It's destroying democracy. It's a place of bullying. It's creating division. It's separating. And yet, for so many of the people in this book, social media is where their living is, you know, and where their marketing is. And And so I was just curious what your personal relationship with it is, because I'm constantly renegotiating my own personal relationship with it.
Yeah, yeah, I love that you brought up Facebook, because I remember when when I joined Facebook, however long ago that was, I too was just like, this is awesome. I feel like I'm
Nothing can go wrong with this.
this is the best ever. And I felt the same way about Instagram, just like, oh wow, it's like I get to create my own magazine, but not. And I am not, I don't know. I have a love-hate relationship, which is the simplest way to put it. I like a lot of what for me, social media at this point is basically Instagram. That's where I spend most of my
Same.
time. Literally. Sometimes that's the bad part. The
Yeah.
bad part is I feel like I used to not be on my phone as much at all. So that's what I don't like, the fact that there is the addictive thing. I have figured out how to not feel insecure on social media. But I think, I don't know, I kind of, sometimes I see it as a fun way to communicate with people. Sometimes I see it as just, this is a tool. I have a book. This is going to help me tell people about my book. And then in times when I do not have a book, it's just, this is what I ate this week. These are the highlights. So it goes back and forth between, I am genuinely trying to promote a thing, to like, this is what's happening in my life, you know? So it does have that personal and professional side for me. And then it does sometimes drive me up the wall, because it's just, it takes up so much time, but it's so kind of silly, you know? So I don't know, but then there are people who, I mean, I'm just making things up as I go along on social media, but I feel
We
like,
all are.
right, exactly. And I'm not really trying to be the most polished person, you know, when I make a thing, it's not edited probably. I do have a friend who makes amazing reels for me, but other than those specific things, nothing is super, it's not a polished presentation or like video on how to do something. But I'm really amazed by some people who do that. And I think there are people in the book who do that. And there are tons of people on Instagram who, it's just it's everything. But it's a necessary thing, kind of necessary, that I sometimes enjoy and sometimes don't enjoy. That's how I would put it. And I personally haven't figured out how to monetize it, and I am grateful because it takes the pressure off. It doesn't have to, like, I can just continue to make things up as I go along in terms of how I play with social media. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it
how.
was interesting to see in the book that there are some people who, like, TikTok is how it's like how they've come into being. And then there are other people who you interview who say very strongly, get off social media. That's my number one piece of advice. It's destroying your creativity. It's putting you into compare and despair. Focus on other things. And then there are other people who are like, this is, my life is literally in this space. It's just, I think it's so interesting. And I think I always have this feeling that like 20 years from now, we're going to look back on all this social media that we were in and think like, wow, it's like we were smoking on airplanes. We didn't, we used to do that. Like we used to give 2-3 hours a day of our lives to this thing that we were holding in our hands. Like I think we're going to slowly wake up to like, yikes, that really took us over there for a while. And yet it is so fun and shiny and appealing and dangerous all at the same time.
Totally.
I wanted to thank you for your book, Cooking Solo. I know we're talking about this beautiful book that I want everyone to buy for everyone for Christmas, for the culture. by Klancy Miller, Black Women and Femmes, Phenomenal Black Women and Femmes in Food, interviews, inspirations, recipes, history. It's just, I mean, look, it's full of notes. I'm keeping this forever. I love it. But you also wrote a book called Cooking Solo that's about how to cook for one. And I think, I'd be making this up, but I think we've reached a point in American history where we actually, more than half of all women will never be, are not married, which has never happened before, and I think is really interesting, and are not in relationships, including me. And so I just wanted to know what what the inspiration for that was, and also, I love the closing. I just have to show everybody a picture of the closing recipe. Is this, and it's your recipe, and it's for raspberry shortcake for one. I mean, there's two of them on here, but I love that the recipe, I don't think I've ever seen a baking recipe that's for one person. It's just it's so sweet. And it says here, I'm a fan of the individual dessert for one, because it feels like an elaborate treat, a decadent reward just because you're worth it. I'm so moved by that. Can you speak to that, and what was the inspiration? And also, can you make this for me?
I'll happily make
right
that
now.
for you. Happily. Let's see. So, all right, I'm going to try to, in my head, I'm trying to compress the story. I once wanted to write a book about my time in Paris as a culinary student, and it got roundly rejected. And my mom was like, she's like, you have something right under your nose, and that will be your first book. And shortly after that, she told me about this story she had heard on NPR about, at that time, it was the census that had uncovered the fact that there are more single people than there have ever been. And she's like, Clancy, there's your audience.
It was
and I was
your
like,
mom's idea.
Yeah. She's like, that's your audience. She's like, you
Wow.
make so many amazing meals for yourself. And I've cooked for my parents on and off at different points. And she's like, she's like, you have an audience. There are people who need this. And I was like, you're right. You're absolutely right. And so it became kind of a way for me to talk about my time in Paris, because that's when I first started cooking for myself. And I was a pastry student. Pastry is very important to me. Dessert is deeply important to me. And I feel like you deserve it, whether you're in a group of people or not. You should have something sweet if you want it. And so I feel like not only do you, as a single person feeding yourself, deserve to have a nice meal, that meal can include the Indian that you would get at a restaurant if you had a hankering for something else. And so I wanted to be very intentional about creating desserts for times when you feel like baking something just for you. And I was very proud and happy that I could figure out how to basically make a cake for one.
I love it so much. And it's also really nice in terms of food portioning, because for me, the serving size of a cake is going to be the cake. Whatever, like I always joke, with a friend, I'm like, the serving, I think it's hilarious, like on a box of Oreos, where like serving size 6 or 5, I'm like, no, we all know that the serving size for a box of Oreos is the Oreos, all of the Oreos.
It's the whole package.
Servings, it's the whole package, right? So like, there's something really nice about like, oh, it's just going to be the right amount, so that I'm not standing over my sink just with a fork eating the entire cake, which
hilarious. Yeah, which, no shame whatsoever.
It's nice. It's a little
built-in
grapes.
Yeah. In case you wanted to make a miniature cake, just for the artistic endeavor and the part where you get to eat it.
And the part where you get to eat it. Clancy, I have stolen you away for an hour, and you are such a delight and such a light. And this offering, so many people in this, so many of the women and femmes in this book have just spoken about doing what they do as an offering, as your title suggests, for the culture. And you've created something that is a historical document and an artistic document, an emotional document, a piece of food history that is so rich and beautiful. And I feel bettered and enriched and informed and inspired for having read it and for having met you. And you have been, as I said, top of our list for who we wanted to get on the Onward Book Club to interview. And I'm so grateful to be able to introduce you to the people who will want to meet these people too, who will want to know about these great leaders in the world of food, and want to know also that the world of food is bigger than we think, and more diverse and more rich. And I just wanted to close by this beautiful quote by Gabrielle E.W. Carter. And she said, there were things I never knew were part of my own food culture as a Black woman in the South. And so it was just so enriching, because I know that French cuisine and Italian cuisine is so revered and so romanticized. And I love French food and I love Italian food, but I didn't know I had my own rich culture at home. And I think that's the other thing. Somebody else spoke in this book about elevating the domestic, and that's something else that you've done, is to elevate the work and the offerings of all these women and all the women unnamed centuries behind them who created this culture, and who we're just beginning to acknowledge as being so vital and beautiful and poetic and grand. So thank you for your vision, and thank you for, as your mother might say, like creating what was right under your nose for the rest of us. And we love you, and everyone who's here, if you could just send up some hearts for Klancy to thank her for being here with us. You're wonderful, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful and honored. Thank you.
See you around.
See you. This was fun.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Thanks.